To the vast majority of people out there, the concept of GTA IV's supposed killer bipedal rat creature lurking in the depths of its subway system is not only laughable, but more importantly impossible, considering that data miners have all but entirely disproven it as an intentional mechanic at this point. But by sheer virtue of there being hundreds of people out there that can genuinely attest to having had at least some personal interaction with what they believe to be the so-called Ratman, means that, like it or not, something definitely does exist. Now, whether or not that necessarily means it's the Ratman in the form and shape that everyone assumes that takes is another thing entirely. I'm aware that people can be mistaken and worse, lie, sure, but call me naive, I just have too much faith in humanity to believe that every single one of them is just fruitlessly clinging on to a lie like this, and one that gets them so brutally made fun of at that. If we're being honest, it's a joke at this point, nothing anyone has taken seriously in a long time. So really, the timing could not be more perfect for something like this. Something to put back all the pieces, to retrospectively put a lid on the phenomenon once and for all, with all of the advantages that hindsight lends us. As we're rapidly approaching what's speculated to be the end of the HD universe, it's easier than ever to separate ourselves from the sensation that GTA IV once was. To step back and look honestly at everything surrounding it to determine what it even was, and perhaps more importantly, regardless of what we want it to be. Not to disprove or mock anyone or even the concept as a whole, rather to dig deeper and uncover the actual point of origin, the cause of all the whispered rumours and widespread accounts, in whatever form or shape that happens to take. Because the truth is, it's not as unlikely as I think most people believe. Our story begins on May the 18th, 2008, around 2 weeks after GTA IV's worldwide release. The gaming publication site Cheat Code Central had just updated their GTA IV page to include a range of additional cheats, secrets and Easter eggs that the authors had found during their time with the game. I think it's important to mention first that at this time Cheat Code Central had an immaculate reputation. It wasn't just used by me personally, but also by everyone I knew, especially when it came to GTA and any news surrounding the series. I feel it's crucial context to add because it's why none of us had any reason whatsoever to doubt the validity of one entry in particular. Walk in the darkest parts of the subway and you might find someone called Ratman. You will not be able to catch up with him, solidifying this officially as the first ever recorded mention of the Ratman myth. Except not exactly. As a side note, you may already know that supposedly from as far back as the 1970s, the UK resort town Southend-on-Sea has had a long history with its own Ratman. Or so the story goes, one night a homeless man sleeping in an underpass was brutally kicked to death by a gang of teenagers. And before the body was discovered and identified, it had been almost entirely devoured by a plague of the city's rats. It's a local legend that has virtually no presence outside the city, and so I don't really want to get too sidetracked discussing it here, because although there are some similarities, they mostly come from it just being a story about rats and a man. The issue I personally take with it as an origin story is that Rockstar is primarily a Scottish development studio with no ties to Southend-on-Sea, of all places, whatsoever. Not only does the legend simply not exist at all outside of the city, there's no recorded mention of it online until at least 2012. 4 years after GTA IV was released, and 4 years after the discussion of its own Ratman had already begun. As a side note to this side note, there's also the 1988 film of the same name, which is worth mentioning if only just because of all the sites that seemed intent on documenting every single one of the obscure movie references present in GTA IV. But it's worth mentioning only to say that it's obviously completely irrelevant in this context. So back on topic, grammatical errors and the initial absurdity aside, the original Cheat Code Central account could potentially have come from a variety of different sources and for a variety of different reasons. It could simply have been the fact that either the article's author or their primary source was just mistaken, or worse, lying themselves. But in my opinion, and far more likely, is that it was just a clever anti-plagiarism measure to deter content thieves. To digress again and add yet more context, it wasn't uncommon for gaming publications around this time to sprinkle in a number of completely fabricated cheats and secrets along with their own genuine ones. This way, if a competing site was caught publishing any of them, they at least had some evidence they could use to accuse them of such. Something I feel is made a lot more likely considering how cutting edge and widely respected Cheat Code Central was at this time. Unfortunately, though, that's still only speculation on my part, because the website's current owners have continually refused to comment on it, and worse still is that the GTA IV article in particular is just listed as having been written by a staff member. So that trail lays cold there, at least. Despite it technically being the first ever recorded mention of the myth though, it's really in name only. The first to attribute the Ratman title to the character, but being easily disproven as the same cause of the wider phenomenon, due mostly to the fact that its description bears no resemblance whatsoever to what it would go on to become in the mainstream consciousness. Fascinatingly, contrary to that, here it's described as being an almost comedic addition to the game. There's no implication whatsoever that it's anything darker, or that should be feared, which at the time only further lended credibility to the claim for me. Regardless of how bleak or morbid it might be in concept, it seems as if every topic Rockstar explores through the GTA series is always through this lens of absurd parody, almost as if they're incapable of taking anything seriously, or at least depicting anything without at least some tongue-in-cheek slant. So as you can probably imagine, it was not even remotely difficult in the slightest to envision something like a Ratman alongside it all. Not even necessarily as an Easter egg or secret, maybe even just something as mundane as a homeless NPC jogging through the subway tunnels drunkenly slurring about how they're the Ratman, or really anything along those lines. It's ridiculous, comical, a potential reference to Batman, and so something absolutely in keeping with Rockstar's usual brand and style of humour. So then, when did all of that change? Naturally, it didn't take long for people to start picking up on the updated page. On the 26th of May the same year, the GTA forums user, Death Dealer, would be the first to hurl the topic into the game's primary, dedicated audience. In their post, they further attest to the site's usual trustworthy reputation, but call into question the validity of the Ratman section in particular, adding that they've spent time in the subway already, but hadn't ever encountered anything like that. Despite maybe not contributing at all to the overall discussion, I've always argued that this thread alone is almost solely responsible for the rumour travelling as far as it did, ultimately going on to shape the digital landscape of video game myths and legends forever, and in major ways, arguably even more so than GTA San Andreas' Bigfoot ever did. Although I understand that might be a controversial take. I just don't think it's a stretch at all to say that it played a massive role in stoking the obsession that the industry now has with the same kind of community-driven analysis of hidden secrets and background details. Lore. The kind that seems to be everywhere nowadays. It came at a time where more of us were online than ever before, with access to discussion boards, video sharing sites, and perhaps even more importantly still, public multiplayer lobbies within the very game itself. So similarly, the rumour seemed to spread like never before, in a fiery explosion of pages and pages of written accounts, pictures, videos, and even just personal stories told by friends or strangers. People were able to collaborate with each other in ways that they weren't ever able to do in search of any other video game rumour or myth before it, all over the world and in their thousands. Amazingly, in researching this, I've come to find that a large part of the game's player base have all spent a significant portion of their formative years making friends and building memories in search of GTA IV's Ratman.
Hello, my name is Matthew.
Me and my buddies have found the legendary Ratman.
We are going for Ratman.
Which is incredible to think about, although still hilarious.
Every weekend, me and my friends would start a free world and all meet in the subway. People online were saying all these things, like how you could find secret characters down there.
That there were all these Easter eggs. We would spend hours just covering the entire circuit.
It wouldn't be an exaggeration to call it a cultural phenomenon, and from what started as a simple post to the GTA forums. It was huge, and there virtually wasn't a single person on Earth who owned the game but hadn't at least heard the name whispered in passing. Which is why I feel like an introduction at this point is massively redundant, but it still leaves us with the all-important burning question. How then are we certain that we're even talking about the same thing?
Everyone was saying there was like this monster rat thing in the subway, and that it would randomly spawn if you were down there for too long.
In short, some say Ratman is this snarling animalistic creature, while others argue it's a grotesque mutated homeless person warped by the decay of the city. The truth is, no one really agrees on anything for certain. All that's known is that it lurks in the subway, and that those who have encountered it fear to ever return. In all seriousness though, the prevailing theories tend to bounce between the phenomenon being some kind of rarely occurring hostile NPC mechanic, and a rare bug associated with the pathfinding of the police inside interiors. There are many others that don't fit into those two categories, don't get me wrong, but practically all of them ultimately come back to being one of those two things. I have to acknowledge the more hardcore extremist views that are actually that there's a half-human, half-rat hybrid put into the game as some kind of Easter egg or secret, but as you can imagine, they're very rarely based on anything we can actually investigate. The issue I've always personally had with them is that the proposed method in which that could still be possible and have stayed hidden from data miners after all these years is insanely elaborate and complex, unlike anything any game developer has ever done before, much less Rockstar in one of their games. So despite the fact that I still take those claims seriously, as I do all of them, I just feel like it's by far the most unlikely explanation. But at the same time though, there isn't really a most likely explanation, because with that having been said, those two theories still don't account for everything. You'll hear stories of how players have almost been tormented by it, with sounds of scratching, ominous whispers from the darkness, with all encounters ultimately seeming to culminate in their health dropping suddenly and out of nowhere, before being attacked, or simply dying and waking up back at the hospital.
After a while, I swear I started to hear, like, scratching and chattering coming from the walls.
And even though I was on low health anyway, it was like I was just killed out of nowhere by something. All I could see was its shadow, and it just looked like one of the hobos.
Now, why this is attributed to Ratman and not literally anything else is odd to say the least, but outside of just how famous the urban legend is, I think it largely comes from various in-universe environmental clues. From the squeaks, shadows, and cut voice lines where train conductors seem to comment on the unnaturally large rats they've seen in the tunnels. If it's not something already in the game, all of this seems to heavily imply that some kind of rat addition was at least planned at some point. Oddly, and the strangest to me by far though, has to be the association the legend has with a number of orange puddles across the subway system's maintenance corridors. To be completely honest with you, it's not something that I've ever understood the relevance of. They're treated, if not as a result of the Ratman character itself, then at least something that indicates you're in an area prone to encounters. Like a hotspot, I guess. My biggest issue with all of this comes from the difficulty I have in separating any of it from every other object in the surrounding environment, or the game for that matter. As I understand it, rats are simply a part of living in New York City, the city the game is based on. As is the homeless population in the tunnels, the strange pools of mystery liquid, and even just the general aggression of passers-by. I'm not here to tell anyone what they've seen or experienced themselves, just what I've personally found myself. And I've personally found all of these things to be almost completely irrelevant, if not then just flat out misinterpretations. If it's not something as mundane and easily dismissed as those examples, it's something that I'm just simply not able to find any evidence of. Like the sounds, for example. They seem to me to be the sparks coming off of the electrical wiring in the tunnels. I guess I can see why it might be thought of as a scratching or squeaking sound, but it's just so obviously not that I almost refuse to believe it's the same sound that's found in all of the accounts I've read. Likewise, the shadows and objects moving around in the dark are so clearly either homeless people or the light of an oncoming train that I can't seem to convince myself that it's possible to mistake them for anything else. Again, when we do anything like this, we have to consider these things, but we also need to have a level of respect for the people who have shared their experiences. So based on that, and the evidence and accounts I've personally gathered, it seems far more likely to me that this just isn't what they're referring to at all, and that I just haven't personally found any examples of it myself. Yet. Whether it was in the same thread on the GTA forums or one of the many other sites that the rumour spilled out onto, when it comes to the early accounts that initially spawned from these discussions, I'm always fascinated to look back and see how relatively tame they all were.
There was just like this thing running left and right across the tracks in the distance. It was already way too far away to catch up to, but I could tell that it was moving way too fast to be one of the normal pedestrians.
They were very normal, almost disappointingly so, and that's mostly because they're written from the perspectives of confused players sharing what they think is a new mechanic or secret in a game that was practically brand new at the time. Descriptions of bugged out ragdoll physics, the pathfinding of certain companion characters, or even just atmospheric effects clipping through the walls of the subway's corridors were all about as exciting as they got. But almost entirely because of that, I've always felt that they're so much more believable than they would go on to become. And it's for that reason that I feel they provide so much more value in solving the larger mystery.
I had a wanted level from walking on the tracks, and as I was running down the line, one of the police officers that was standing on the platform behind me just shot past me and off into the tunnel.
Just honest takes from average, everyday players sharing their personal thoughts and findings for no other reason than to try and contribute to the wider discussion. Sure, I might know that the sounds in the subway tunnels are the sparks from electrical wiring, that the shadows are NPCs, and so on, but is that so obvious to a casual player? Someone who might have only played the game once in their lives? I only know these things because I just so happen to be someone who pays extremely close attention to these aspects of a game's environment. But the reality is, the vast majority of people simply don't. and will likely just take everything at face value and on first impressions. There's nothing wrong with that at all, certain things just appeal to certain people, but it's important context to add when you're trying to interpret where these posts are coming from.
There was this one time me and my friends were exploring that spot with the orange rust patches, and out of nowhere the game just started blasting this deafening metallic screeching sound. None of my friends could hear it, and to this day, no one seems to be able to explain what that could have been.
Again, I've made the decision to take every single one of them seriously, but something that needs to be taken into consideration is the fact that the users posting them have no idea themselves. Because they can't know. We don't even really know now. Because if there is an explanation for all of this, simply by virtue of that, we can confidently say that it must have nothing to do with what we're discussing here. The majority of the stories I've come across are from people simply asking, hey, has anyone heard the scratching before? Seen the shadows before? And in most cases an explanation is provided and the mystery reaches a satisfying conclusion right there. But those aren't the stories that stick around. Sure, that could just be because they weren't provided with a sufficient enough explanation. That's not to say that everyone is entitled to one, and I don't think it's anyone's responsibility to provide them. It just makes me wonder why. Because it's a possibility that there just isn't one.
I know there are NPCs that are supposed to spawn in the subway tunnels, but sometimes I would see shadows follow me that just weren't coming from anywhere.
My health just slowly hits 0. In the death screen, when it's all black and white, I saw some kind of bugged out NPC.
So the point I really want to try and stress here is that the first and biggest commonality between the most trustworthy accounts is simply the fact that there just quite literally isn't an explanation. As we know all too well at this point, however, unfortunately, this early stage wouldn't last long, as the intensity of the accounts seemed to grow exponentially and the discussion spun wildly out of control, harshly veering into a lot of serious claims from users, all boasting to somehow know all of the answers despite the fact that these answers all differed massively and couldn't be replicated by anyone else. Looking back, it's obvious to me that this period in particular is almost entirely responsible for the awful reputation that the discussion has to this day. Although generally speaking, the inevitable side effect of any kind of explosion in popularity like this is just a lot of unwanted and negative attention, it brought with it a lot of baggage that would permanently discourage people from even talking about it going forward. Exaggerated, overly fake parody videos, and oversaturation of fictitious creepypastas and LARPs, all made by people with no real interest in the subject in an attempt to capitalize on the popularity of the subject. What started as accounts of strange noises, feeling watched, and in rare cases seeing some kind of shadowy figure through the darkness, quickly turned into these almost religious experiences, as laughable as that might sound. Despite the fact that I've set out to be as kind as possible here, where I've always drawn the line is when I see a claim from anyone that seems to be subtly implying that you almost need to believe in it to be able to find anything in the first place. I have no hang-ups about calling them what they are, but despite how obviously ridiculous it might sound to me, there are an unbelievable number of these people out there. People who discuss Ratman as if it's some kind of spiritual being, haunting the game in the literal sense.
There were all these people saying all these things that you could, find Ratman by holding down certain buttons and boarding a train for 2 hours. Then there would be a wall in the subway that you could just walk through or something.
It was funny. I remember someone once tried to tell me that the reason I couldn't find anything in the subway was because I wasn't playing the game at 3 a.m.
By far the most outspoken and staunch proponents of this theory was the GTA forums user Space Monkeys, who gained immense levels of notoriety during this time for their ruthless crusade against anyone and everyone who would dare doubt its existence. They were only really one of many, sure, don't get me wrong, but they made a name for themselves in particular for just how passionately they seemed to believe in Ratman's presence in the game, spreading stories of their supposed encounters, but perhaps even more bizarrely still, correcting others on theirs. Again, nothing really unique there, but there's someone absolutely crucial to single out here, as on June the 24th, 2008, they'd go on to post the now infamous, poorly focused, blurred image of what would be, to this day, the only photo evidence of the myth. Now, it's a really strong word that I try to avoid using whenever I can, but simply put, I really hate this image. In short, it supposedly shows what's supposed to be a kind of cartoonish looking anthropomorphic humanoid rat. To be completely honest, I'm still not completely sure what it's even supposed to show, where or how it was taken, and the countless times it's been analysed and dissected over the years hasn't ever cleared any of that up for me. It's almost certainly fake, and so not really anything worth taking too seriously, but what makes it infinitely worse for me is the legacy it would go on to have. Anyone out there who has ever attempted to look into the topic since knows that for some strange reason, everyone seems to incorrectly start here, with this image. YouTubers, forum users, or just anyone I speak to personally all seem to have this misconception that it's the origin, the source of the myth, which is maddening for obvious reasons. Possibly most tragically of all, however, is how it painted everyone in these threads with the same level of credibility. In all honesty, I know why it's been constantly held up to this day. It's the closest we've ever come to any photo evidence at all, and people just want something to look at. Which is completely understandable, but aside from just being misleading, it also presented what was by far the biggest issue I faced while putting this together. Trying to convince every single person that contributed to this that I wasn't trying to make fun of them and that I did actually have a genuine interest in what they might have seen was practically impossible. So much so that very quickly I learned that the only way I was going to be able to collect everything I have here is with the assurance that I wouldn't be naming or identifying anyone in the process. Again, I absolutely understand why the picture of a mouse person is at least one contributing factor. It's just really telling of the reputation the topic has nowadays, and means that at a certain point you're kind of just going to have to take me at my word. Which I know isn't ideal, but in the end it's not as if solving each individual separate account would help anyone anyway. The real issue is that it's just harder to validate their reliability and use them to paint a clearer picture overall if they come from anonymous users. It's sad, sure, but I think ultimately I was more than happy to go this route just because how useful they are in doing that depends entirely on how you intend on using them. I really can't stress enough how much of an actual, genuine fascination I have with this subject. So naturally, I think above anything else I'll say or do here, it's really important to me that I just try to document and record as many of the stories as physically possible, regardless of their source or reliability, and if for no other reason than to simply preserve a more accurate idea and feel of what it was like at this time. What it was like to take part in what was honestly a historical event for a lot of people. Why I feel like I'm the best person to do this, I get into in the video in which I find the ghosts and UFOs of San Andreas, but in short and to summarise, because of a personal experience, I feel like I know more than anyone that these bizarre little experiences can happen. That they're not just possible, but in some cases, likely. All without them, actually being anything at all. How they have the potential to happen in any game, but that they're especially prevalent in ones that have worlds as massive and complex as the GTA series. With their vast interconnected systems of variable components, the physics engine, pedestrian AI, traffic, environmental effects, and so on, practically every individual aspect has some kind of random element to it. Meaning that obviously, when they're all working together, side by side like this, you're just never going to be able to account for every single possibility, as rare and unlikely as some of them might be. I mean, just taking into account the sheer size of the player base on top of that, this being, at the time, one of the best-selling and most widely played games of all time, millions and millions of people all over the world were panning out and prodding every single corner of the game world, testing its limits and messing with every single obscure mechanic and tiny detail in ways in which the developers might not have even considered. In ways in which statistically they couldn't have considered. Not to mention, especially when the game eventually hit PC and it had to try and accommodate every single type and configuration of hardware that was on the market at that time. Because for that reason, we can't even really rule out graphical and rendering issues. All of these are influencing factors, and my point here is that even if it was only just a bug or glitch, in conjunction with some kind of mass hysteria, statistically someone was going to experience the rarest and most unlikely order and combination of them eventually. And it could even have been the only time it would happen in the game's history. You only really have to look as far as something like speedrunning. A resource that we're extremely lucky to have because it gives us hours and hours of unedited, raw gameplay footage that we just wouldn't have had otherwise. Even if you're someone that's never had it happen to you in-game, if you're someone who watches these streams, you know exactly how common completely random, freak incidents of all shapes and sizes are, across all of the games, but seemingly especially this one.
One time we saw a pedestrian fight the cops, like it was some random event of them chasing a guy, but the thing is, he would not die. They kept shooting him and he was just in a fighting stance, punching them and beating them up.
In fact, most of the standout clips I've seen are all things I would have at one point in my life outright refused to believe were even possible. I probably would have even argued that they were just made up or exaggerated. Yet, here they are, happening, all the time. My point here being, however unlikely it might be, that still doesn't mean that it can't happen. So just imagine for a second how many of these little moments must have just been lost forever. The sheer number of insane and bizarre things that, again, statistically must have happened, but that died in that very moment simply because most people just don't ever really feel the need to share them. Especially not if they, for whatever reason, happen to think it was related to some myth or rumour that was going around at the time. A situation that I just don't think is unlikely at all. Again, I've been on both ends of this myself, so I'm just as guilty, but I really think that we're doing a massive disservice when we immediately dismiss or ridicule these things when they do come up. The impression I now have from speaking with a lot of these people firsthand is that being made fun of was just what they were expecting. And sure, in any public space, I think you should expect that to a certain extent. I just think that generally everyone can agree that it's just not a productive way to talk about anything. And I don't think that's controversial. My own personal interest in the subject aside, I think because of that, throughout this, I found myself making a real conscious effort to try and encourage these kinds of things as much as possible, even if they're as seemingly insignificant as a recount of someone else's story. Again, that might just be easy for me to say because I personally enjoy hearing them, but there's also the fact that there are very real and obvious benefits to being able to collect all of them into one giant throbbing mass like this. Stepping back, we can draw lines between them, compare their similarities, differences, and reveal so much about what's going on with the wider scope that lends us. Sure, the truth is, no one story is going to really be the answer to it all, and expecting it to is being unrealistically optimistic, to say the least. It's just that the unfortunate situation this has all left us in is one where people have become so reluctant to speak on the topic with any sincerity that it's almost impossible to coax them out. Now, I'm not really sure what we can do to fix that, if anything can at this point, but what I do know is that it would be hypocritical of me to say all of this and not at least share what I have myself. Again, I'm not under the impression that it'll change anything or convince anyone, don't get me wrong, but if you're trying to get others to open up, my hope is that doing so yourself first at least makes it easier. So with that having been said, I should probably start by saying that sadly over the years I can't claim to have had any encounters or experiences myself. But that doesn't mean that I haven't felt it. Whoa. I think most people deep down know there's nothing actually down here. I also think that a lot of places in this game are the thing that they're scared of to begin with, if that makes sense. Heading back into the subway again after all this time, and with the intention of finding something lurking down here, I was hit almost immediately with the biggest and most likely cause of the rumours. The game's crushing atmosphere. Like, if you were in a subway tunnel like this in real life, it would be completely normal to feel kind of uneasy. It's like we treat it like it's weird just because it's in a video game. Really, the sheer number of people that seem to treat this place like it's the darkest, spookiest part of the game is kind of a testament to how good a job they did at, like, digitally interpreting what it is. I've always thought that the fact that it was in a video game kind of obscures that in a weird way. Because you're so used to going to all these like weird and strange places in them. But then, like here, you've just got a subway. So it makes you kind of numb to the experience. With the crushing ambience, lighting, and the thick, tangible atmosphere they both create, there's an ominous feeling to this place that's almost real. As strange as that might sound. I don't think people really talk about that much, but in that sense, most settings and locations have some kind of integrated feeling that comes with them wherever they're depicted. It's uncanny, but you have to wonder how much of that comes from how brilliant a job they did in building an ultra-realistic subway system, and how much of it just comes naturally with being a subway system in concept. A cold, dark, industrial underground megastructure, stretching indefinitely off into the darkness and hiding God knows what. Because that's what a subway system is, and a realistic, accurate depiction of one would just be an even more realistically, accurately spooky one. To use another example, scenic mountainscapes in real life tend to conjure breathtaking feelings of awe, so you would expect an accurate, realistic digital recreation of one to have the same effect. What I'm trying to say is that I don't think that the feelings themselves are necessarily exclusively caused by how well the scene is interpreted, rather the decision to include somewhere that naturally inspires them to begin with. That being said though, with Liberty City being a city based on New York, Rockstar really didn't have a choice. They had to include a subway. So my question is, did Rockstar deliberately design the atmosphere here to be this ominous and terrifying, or is it ominous and terrifying just because it's a subway? Another huge aspect I'm aware of is that if this were a real place, and I was actually here, I would have concluded a long time ago that the dangers of exploring it like this might not be worth the risk to my life. In a video game, obviously, that's not a factor you even have to consider, because in theory you can go wherever it will let you, even if it kills you multiple times over. and to scrutinize the details that might not always hold up when isolated like this. But to find what? The truth is, ultimately, nothing. And as hard as that might be to believe, for various reasons, it means that at a certain point you have to ask yourself, well, in that case, what were we looking for? What were we afraid of? And it's that which leaves the door open just enough for your imagination to step in and miraculously conjure a whole host of weird and wonderful characters that may, but most likely may not, be lurking down here. I think the most fascinating aspect of this for me is that despite the fact that we can compare the atmosphere here to that of a real-life subway, this isn't something that could ever actually happen in one. The depths of a subway is generally so off-limits to most people in their everyday lives that there's a chance this just hasn't ever occurred naturally before. So with that being the unintentional side, what about the intentional one? The sounds, ambience, and atmospheric effects in the subway are really no different to any of the ones found anywhere else throughout the game, but they become ominous and startling simply from being set against that as a backdrop. Again, I'm not certain that that was intentional, but I think there's plenty of evidence elsewhere to suggest that Rockstar wanted the game to feel like this. Wanted the game to look, sound, and play like there are darker, hidden aspects to these spots. I think this is really important to discuss because if it's true, then I don't think it's a stretch at all to claim that Rockstar created Ratman, and that the legend is real in that sense. That the myth wasn't simply something perpetuated by sleep-deprived preteens, rather a natural response to the intentional way in which this world was developed. The abandoned factory, for example, is another huge source of a lot of the game's urban legends. And although the reasons for that are likely entirely due to its appearance in a specific mission of the game's story, it happens to be the spot that, in the end, ultimately gave me the final push I needed to make this. While exploring it, I found exactly the same crushing atmosphere and environmental storytelling that seems to have inspired practically every single one of the game's other myths. But I also noticed something else. Something I hadn't before. The function the engine uses to cull the environment when you're inside interiors doesn't just do that. It also changes the weather, dulls the colour palette, and shrouds the streets below in a blanket of grey mist. And it's that I genuinely cannot think of any other reason for than to purposefully set the scene in preparation for an urban legend like this to spawn. An urban legend like Ratman. Entirely due to Rockstar's efforts here, that happening was almost a certainty, and I can't seem to bring myself to imagine any kind of scenario where they didn't know this was going to happen. Of course, though, we're not just talking about any urban legend, we're talking about one in particular. So with that having been said, when I consider all of these things together, I realise that for all of these reasons, what we're dealing with here could be the only example of it ever. The only environment where the conditions were just right, perfect even, for a legend like this to even be possible. And that it could have only really have spawned from here, from this game and during this era. First of all, you need the timing to be perfect. A period in time where online games, web forums and social media were widely available but hadn't been around long enough for people to have numbed to this kind of sensationalism. Then you need the perfect game, huge and complex enough to have that immense scale of unpredictability, but with the largest player base physically and technically possible as well. Because what's the point if that unpredictability isn't being actively tested enough to produce the rarer and more unusual results? Then, perhaps most importantly of all, you have to have an appropriate stage, an atmosphere that creates that expectation. that communicates to you that there's something potentially lurking in the unseen and undiscovered corners. An environment otherwise so crammed full of as many tiny but impressively elaborate minute details as possible. So much so that you'd have no reason to think that there wasn't anything hiding in the subway. A world that feels real, alive, and grounded, as if this place could exist. So it needs the visual fidelity to match, to look as realistic as the models, texture resolution, and post-processing effects from this era allows. All to the extent in which it's impossible to not at least partly feel like you're actually there, in the game yourself, and to experience that element of risk and caution that naturally comes with that. To put this as simply as possible, and needless to say, these are all just really hard things to do, because for that, the game needs to be incredibly well made, cutting edge. It needs to be at the forefront in terms of what the industry is capable of, in every sense. So ultimately, from all of this, I can only conclude that it had to be this game for this to happen. It could only have been a Rockstar game. It could only have been 2008's GTA IV. And it's for that reason I genuinely believe this just couldn't have happened before, and why it most likely will never happen again. As tedious and pedantic as mentioning all of this might seem, it's something that I feel is absolutely crucial to lay out first because it sets the scene. All of the previously mentioned factors that contributed to this myth exploding like it did are really the foundation from which it was inspired. It's easy to dismiss what people have seen or found down here when it's on paper, completely devoid of context, but the framing is what determined how these things were interpreted, and so the framing can tell us so much more than I think most people realise. So with that in mind, what did I actually find down here? Well, in short, some really weird things, but nothing that doesn't have what I think is a really interesting explanation behind it. So with that, here is absolutely everything that I believe has been attributed to the legend of Ratman in GTA IV. Based on everything I've found so far, I'm confident that what we're looking for here is some way to interpret a kind of bug or glitch that's exclusive to the subway system. So at the very least, I'll be starting there first. Needless to say, I'm no expert on the technical reasons behind any of this, but in particular, I've always been subconsciously aware of a specific vertex rendering bug that happens when certain models collide with certain surfaces. I distinctly remember first seeing it in Halo 3, but really my understanding is that mesh explosions like this have the potential to happen anywhere and in any game. It's usually when the data responsible for rendering the geometry in a character model is either corrupted or just really wrong for what could be one of many reasons, but the results always tend to look the same. Again, I'm not certain that it's even the same thing, or simply a completely unrelated physics issue, but it's something that I've seen a number of times throughout this game, and it seems to be especially prevalent with the surfaces and geometry found in the subway, for whatever reason. I only managed to capture these few examples of it, and I know it's nothing huge, but it's enough to prove that it can happen at least. If only really, really rarely. But how infrequently it does happen is just yet something else that I've always thought must have really exaggerated how unnatural and bizarre it is for those who have witnessed it, because it's just not even close to anything that you would see just through casual play. It's when we look at this in conjunction with all of the other odd little quirks to the game's physics engine though, that we start to see how they potentially could have interacted with each other to produce results closer to those of the more outlandish and stranger accounts. To use some specific examples of the game's odd and unpredictable physics, the most well known would probably be the swing set launchpad. But other significantly more obscure ones are things like box surfing or Molotov skydiving. All of these things on their own might just be uncommon or seemingly random bugs, but together I genuinely believe that they could quite easily account for the sightings that report some kind of dark, shapeless mass shooting off or disappearing into the tunnel, which is quite a significant portion of them.
In the death screen, when it's all black and white, I saw some kind of bugged out NPC with like sharp stuff sticking out of them.
I just don't think it's impossible at all to imagine a scenario wherein an NPC's pathing leads them stumbling onto the tracks, clipping off into the tunnel, vanishing as some kind of misshapen, distant silhouette. As hilarious as that might sound, having just stripped it of all its mystery. This is all made even more likely still, though, through another strange, seemingly random occurrence that I've come to witness down here. You've probably seen it yourself by now, but by standing around on a platform for an extremely long period of time, you'll eventually see all of the NPCs suddenly and completely out of nowhere start screaming and running out of the station. I know enough about GTA IV's engine to know that NPCs have panic states, and that they're usually triggered by seeing or hearing a gun, or there just being some kind of fight or confrontation happening nearby. The only theory that I could arrive at that would sufficiently explain why this happens is that maybe the walkways or the street above isn't being fully de-rendered. At least enough so that it isn't completely out of everyone's line of sight. There are random chance events that can happen between any two NPCs, but there tends to be more police than usual in the subway stations. My thinking is that maybe some kind of chase is being triggered somewhere not visible to the player, and that all of the NPCs on the platform act as if it's happening right next to them. Regardless of the reason behind it, when it happens I've noticed that there's a very small chance that some of them will jump onto the tracks and sprint off into the tunnel. If you manage to spot it happening early enough, you can try to catch up with them, which is really surreal, but as the rumour suggests, it's practically impossible if they've got the lead on you. Unless you're for some reason really persistent. It seems to me like, once they're already on the tracks, their pathfinding mechanism looks for the next nearest exit, because they eventually reach the next station and just filter into the other NPCs on the platform like nothing ever happened. Again, I'm not certain of the technical reasoning behind this, but I don't think it really matters. Just that it can and does happen. The important point here being that pedestrians can just start running down the line for no obvious reason. Because really, is that not what started the Ratman myth to begin with? Even if we ignored all of the other texture, rendering and physics bugs that can happen alongside this and could account for the more insane, outlandish sightings, I genuinely believe that this alone easily explains the vast majority of the average sightings and encounters with some kind of sprinting, screaming thing down here. Which, again, is most of them, especially the early accounts. So really, here it is. This is Ratman, and I really think it's as simple as that. It's worth keeping in mind that the original Cheat Code Central post only really described Ratman so much as to say it's an NPC that runs through the subway. And so this is what people were looking for. This is what people were reporting. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that it stopped being seen very shortly after the subject stopped being taken seriously. Because it wasn't, and still isn't, that spectacular, or even out of the ordinary. In fact, even if the original Cheat Code Central account existed in exactly the way it reported, if we're being honest, it would still be quite boring. So maybe Ratman was never found because no one cared enough to really look for it, until it had already ballooned into something so far-fetched that there was no possible way it could exist anyway. So if it was as simple as that and had stopped there with those early forum posts, I'm not sure it would have even gained the reputation it has today. A reputation that would warrant a video like this. So what caused the escalation? There are plenty of other things, don't get me wrong. One in particular that I was desperate to try and capture for this, but just couldn't no matter how hard I tried, is when the train's texture doesn't fully render for whatever reason. Years ago, when the game was brand new, I distinctly remember hanging around down here and seeing a bug where the subway train wasn't fully rendering, but all of the passengers were, creating this really surreal view of a perfectly straight line of seated NPCs hovering across the tracks. For a long time, I actually thought this is what people were seeing, The noise the train makes when it isn't visible as well is something that I can absolutely see as giving off that impression if the circumstances were just right. Unfortunately though, after all these years, it's not something that I could ever manage to get to happen again, and I still haven't seen it happen since. So unless it's something that someone else can document, you're probably just gonna have to take my word for it. But trust me, it wasn't as if I didn't try. Everything. I put an unreasonable amount of effort into this. I bought every port of the game, even left all of them running for the better part of a day, multiple times, but to no success. A theory of mine is that it could have just been my Xbox 360 console at the time, because my understanding is that these things are usually associated with disk read errors, what with that being the physical mechanism that streams certain data from the disk. Ironically though, in doing all of this to try and capture one specific example of a disk read error, I actually managed to capture several others in the process.
Whoa.
It's largely irrelevant, sure, but I think it's something really important to at least mention in a video covering everything related to this topic, because it shows how far it managed to get simply from the misinterpretation of very normal but unlikely things. Which is why I've decided to build up to this. The lore surrounding Ratman was built very slowly over time and from many different people's accounts, but unanimously everyone seemed to very quickly adopt the Eastern Service Tunnel specifically as the place to go if you were looking to find anything related to it. In most cases it was referred to literally as Ratman's Nest, or lair. And for what it's worth, which is admittedly very little, it also happens to be the place in which the supposed photo was reported to have been taken. So there's that much at least, but if we're simply viewing it at face value, it's just a service tunnel. We're to assume it was implemented into the game for use during the bank robbery mission, where you need to evade the police and escape the subway. But I've always felt like its most standout features here were because of that. It's this unmarked door hidden across the street from the station's main entrance, so it's really out of the way and not widely known about because sadly very few people ever reached that point in the game's story. So to most people, it really is just that. This odd, elaborately detailed hidden underground tunnel that, like any of the game's other dark corners, is just generally a really unsettling place. This sequence of dimly lit backrooms, ominous flickering lights, all this old, rusty machinery whirring away with clouds of steam gently rolling through like a mist. On the lowest floor, just off of the tracks, is one room in particular that has the potential to spawn a single engineer NPC. Really, it's the only spot across the entire subway network that does, and because of where it happens to be, understandably, they're very often mistaken for Ratman itself. In fact, most of the sightings from here are very easily disproven as such, whether it's just the glimpse of movement out of the corner of your eye, or just them suddenly sprinting down the corridor at you. The point I'm trying to make here is that this is something that's fairly well documented and so easily explained. But it's important to distinguish because there are other things down here that aren't so easily explained. You might have seen or heard of it already, but completely outside of the Ratman discussion entirely are a number of players who have also reported finding sometimes multiple dead bodies down here.
Why is there a dead guy right there?
I decided to leave discussing this until now simply because I don't think there's a way to misinterpret this. I don't even really think it's a bug. If we're to assume this is an intentional mechanic, at the very least, alone, it would seem like just another potential form of environmental storytelling. A secret or hint that a murderer or serial killer is using the tunnels to dump dead bodies. Which, like we've established at the beginning of this video, isn't unlikely at all, considering the fact that if that is the case, it wouldn't even be the first time Rockstar has done that exact same thing. GTA San Andreas also features a secret mass grave for that very same reason. So as you can imagine, in putting this together, this was something that I felt was absolutely crucial to try and capture myself. If not just because of that, then at least to prove it. Just when I was starting to think that it might not actually ever happen again though, after countless reloads and the route from the safe house to the service tunnel having been permanently burned into my subconscious, there it was. From what I can find, which I have to be honest is next to nothing, the NPC used here can be literally anyone from the game's pool of standard pedestrians. Again, this is just speculation, I could be wrong about any of this, but for that reason I've always thought it was easy to rule out the possibility that it's one of the engineers from a lower level. I've heard it speculated before that it could just be a bugged spawn point, causing them to somehow clip through the floor in some instances, or plummet from a height, dying in the room above to be discovered by unwitting players. But as it's clearly not one of the engineer models, I've always found it difficult to accept that. Sure, that doesn't mean that the same thing isn't happening just with another NPC, it just means that there's a pedestrian in the subway that shouldn't be there, that has no other reason to be there. Regardless though, and to get back on topic, naturally it didn't take long or even much thought for people to begin attributing the bodies to Ratman, using them as proof that the myth was real in so much as it was an intended conclusion of the deliberate hints Rockstar had placed throughout the subway, and to a lesser extent, the entire game. Whether or not that's true is a big deal, because like some of my other discoveries, what would make this verifiable proof would ultimately come down to whether or not it was provably intentional. Did Rockstar deliberately design a function of this area to include concrete evidence of a killer lurking in the subway? Or are these just NPCs that have clipped through the geometry and now we're looking way too deeply into it? It's most likely the latter, but I just think it's fascinating to think about. If we're talking in terms of definition, I think we can all agree that for something to be considered intentional and not just a bug, it needs to have a specific, clear, obvious function defined in the game's code. The issue with that arises in cases such as these, however, because despite how much it's been picked apart over the years, the code isn't exactly something we have free open access to. And even in the areas where we do, it's an extremely thin, blurry line that isn't always as cut and dry as it might seem. Functions like these that don't have any uniquely associated models, textures, or audio files don't always proudly announce their intentions, and in most cases something that looks like it's handling a completely irrelevant component of the game world can actually be holding the entire thing together. What this all means in the end is that the only person that can ever really know their own true intentions would be the developer or the programmer themselves, and I think that was by far the biggest realization I had while making this. Despite how long I've spent not just with the game, but specifically exploring its myths and legends, looking for anything, sadly nothing I've ever found comes close to any of the accounts or descriptions of Ratman that I've found online. But that's exactly how it occurred to me. What gained traction as merely an NPC running through the subway, it wasn't really anything out of the ordinary enough to be worth exploring. But it was enough for it to covertly enter the mainstream consciousness, to the extent in which it occupied a space in most people's minds as this potential hidden mechanic made to stalk or torment players who were exploring the underground tunnels. Meaning that from here and from that point onwards, any and all unexplainable things that wasn't really anything became Ratman. Rumours and urban legends like this don't just come from thin air though. There's always something that ignites them like this, at least initially. Ratman just gave all of those experiences a single name, a single face, and a single explanation. Again, I think the real debate to be had here is whether or not Rockstar are responsible for that, and if so, then how much? Which is a really strange conversation to have, but whenever I pursue this line of thinking, I find I always tend to come to very similar conclusions. Sure, that has a lot to do with how I just personally play games, but nowhere has it rang so true and resonated with me this much. Whether they publicly comment on it or not, the game's programmers, artists, and designers are the only ones that will ever know their own intentions. So anything outside of that, really, can only ever be either personal interpretation or at most speculation. So really, how much do their intentions even matter in the first place? It was only when making this, at my desk in the early hours, did it suddenly occur to me that with that being the case, everything is personal interpretation. The only thing that matters is personal interpretation. If the experience you've had with the game led you to believe that you had found or seen something like this, lurking in the subway, then that's just what the game is to you. Why should that be made any more or less valid just because one of the developers came out to publicly and formally announce whether or not that was what they were trying to do? Because it isn't, at all. Games, like any other art form, are ultimately just what you get out of them personally, and if you enjoy this side of them, then why wouldn't you play them like this? To explore the darker and more obscure elements, regardless of if they're just a bug, glitch, intentional, or just psychosis. Because why would you restrict them like that? In that sense, and to conclude all of this by wrapping it up into a single sentence, I think, in the end, those who cared enough to go looking for Ratman were the only ones who ever truly found it.